The fever took her mother on a winter morning when Zareth was 10 summers old. Not drowning,
We
not
can't
battle,
ignore
not
this
any
any
of the
longer.
warriors' deaths that
I
orc
know,
children
but what
learned to
can we
expect and
do?
honor.
We have to be
Just
ready.
sickness, the
It's
kind that
almost
swept through the
ready.
northern settlements in
I'll give it
harsh
a turn.
seasons and took the
Smells
vulnerable
wonderful.
without mercy. Zareth had
It's getting
watched
worse out
helplessly
there.
as her
I
mother
know,
burned with
but we
fever.
have each
She
other.
couldn't fight,
Always.
couldn't cure, couldn't stop, with all the determination in her young heart. Her mother had been a healer, ironic and cruel. She'd saved dozens of others from lesser illnesses, but when her own body turned against her, none of her knowledge mattered. She died over 3 days, lucid enough at the end to tell Zareth to be strong, to lead, to never let fear make her small. "You have fire in you," her mother had whispered with her last breaths. "Don't let anyone put it out. Not duty, not tradition, not fear. Promise me." Zareth had promised, and her mother had closed her eyes and never opened them again. Her father never said Zareth should have done more, should have tried harder, should have saved her mother somehow. He didn't have to. The silence between them said everything. He'd remarried within a year to a female who looked at Zareth with thinly veiled resentment, and Zareth had learned that some losses carved you hollow and never let you fill up again. That was the day Zareth learned to be strong, because being weak meant drowning in grief that had no outlet and no end. 23 years later, Zareth lay in a different kind of dying and wondered if her mother had felt the same cold certainty in those final moments. The knowledge that the end was coming and all the strength in the world couldn't stop it. The grain pit smelled of rot and old timber and her own blood. 3 days of rain had turned it into a tomb. Above her, through the collapsed wooden beams that pinned her left leg at an angle that made looking at it nauseating, Zareth could see a rectangle of gray sky. Storm clouds, always storm clouds. The weather in the Pacific Northwest didn't believe in mercy any more than fever had believed in her mother's healing skills. Her ribs screamed with every breath. The gash across her torso had stopped bleeding sometime yesterday, not because it had healed, but because she had nothing left to give. Fever painted everything in watercolors, soft and unreal, just like the fever that had taken her mother. She could feel her body shutting down, systems failing one by one like candles blown out in a drafty hall. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Zareth Varmalthor, widow of the great war chief leader of the United Northern Clans, wasn't supposed to die forgotten in human territory, alone in a hole in the ground like an animal that had crawled away to perish in privacy. She was supposed to die in battle, or in her bed surrounded by warriors singing her deeds, or at the very least with a blade in her hand and her enemy's blood on her teeth. Not like this. Never like this. The wood above her groaned, more rain coming. If the structure collapsed completely, it wouldn't matter that she was already dying. She'd be crushed or drowned, and either way, no one would ever know what happened to Zareth Varmalthor. She'd simply vanish, another mystery, another ghost story for the clans to whisper about during long winters. Perhaps that was fitting. She'd come to these mountains to disappear after all. 6 months ago, she'd stood beside Malthor's deathbed in the great hall of the Northern Keep. Her husband had been a mountain of a male, 9 feet of muscle and scarred green skin, a warrior who'd united 5 clans through sheer force of will and the kind of charisma that made orcs follow him into battles they knew they couldn't win. He'd been dying for weeks, a gut wound that had festered despite the healer's best efforts, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The hall had been empty that night. Malthor had demanded privacy for his final words, and what he said changed everything. "Don't let them make you a prize." His voice had been a whisper, barely audible over his labored breathing. His hand, once strong enough to break stone, trembled as it gripped hers. "You're a leader, Zareth. Always have been. Taught you everything I knew because I saw it in you from the first day. That fire, that mind. You could lead better than any of those fools who'll come sniffing around my corpse." "Rest," she'd told him, because she couldn't bear to hear the rest. "No time for rest. Listen to me. They're going to try to marry you off. Tradition, they'll say. Political stability. But what they mean is they want my lands, my seat on the council, my legacy. And they think the fastest way to get it is through you." He'd coughed, then blood on his lips. "Don't let them. You're not property. You're not a bridge to power. You're Zareth, just Zareth, and that's more than enough." He died 3 hours later, and the proposals started within a week. First came Thrak of the Mountain Clan, who'd presented himself at her door with a ceremonial axe and a speech about honor and duty. She declined politely, and he'd left with his pride intact but his ambitions crushed. Then Grom of the River Clan, who'd been less subtle. He'd offered wealth status protection. She'd refused less politely this time, and he'd left angry. Third was Cravath, who'd shown up drunk and demanding, insisting that it was her duty to marry again, that a widow of her status couldn't remain alone. She'd thrown him out physically, and he'd left with a broken nose and a grudge. The fourth proposal had come from Drekthar, Malthor's cousin, a male she'd never liked, never trusted, and who'd always looked at her the way a merchant looked at valuable merchandise. He'd arrived with an entourage all ceremony and political theater, and he'd made his intentions clear immediately. The clans need stability. Malthor's reforms need a strong hand to maintain them. And you, dear cousin widow, need protection. The council is already questioning your ability to hold Malthor's seat. There are whispers that you're too soft, too human sympathetic, too weak to lead. Marry me, and I'll silence those whispers. Rishwaz, and he'd trailed off, letting the threat hang in the air. Zareth had looked at him, really looked at him and seen the truth. He didn't care about Malthor's reforms. He didn't care about the clans or stability or anything beyond his own ambition. He saw her as a stepping stone, a piece on a game board to be claimed and controlled. And in that moment, she'd made her decision. She'd fled 3 weeks later in the dark of night, wearing plain leathers and carrying only what she could fit in a pack. No guards, no ceremony, no explanation, just gone. She'd headed south toward the human territories where orc politics held no weight, and she could be no one. Not a widow, not a leader, just a woman trying to figure out who she was beneath all the titles and expectations. The plan had been simple: disappear for a few months, let the council sort out succession. Without her, maybe never go back. She had coin weapons and skills. She didn't need a clan that saw her as a prize instead of a person. Then the storm hit. She'd been seeking shelter when she found the abandoned farmstead. The Carver place, according to the rotted sign swinging from a post. The buildings were half-collapsed victims of time and weather and the fever that had killed the family years ago. But the grain storage pit looked intact, and Zareth had thought it might offer protection from the rain. She'd been wrong. The timber roof had given way the moment she'd stepped inside ancient wood, finally surrendering to rot. She'd fallen 12 feet, felt something in her legs snap with a sound like breaking branches, felt the beam come down across her ribs with crushing force. And then there was just pain and rain and the slow realization that she was going to die here. 3 days. 3 days of rain and fever and the kind of loneliness that made dying seem almost peaceful in comparison. 3 days of thinking about her mother's fever, about Malthor's deathbed advice, about all the choices that had led her to this hole in the ground. She'd made peace with it mostly. Better to die free than live as Drekthar's political tool. Better to end in obscurity than become someone else's possession. At least that's what she told herself during the moments when the fever made her lucid enough to think it all. The fourth day dawned gray and cold. Zareth heard the footsteps before she saw anything. Small feet, light and quick, moving through the overgrown grass around the pit. She tried to call out, but her voice came out as barely a croak. Her throat was raw from thirst and screaming that first day when she'd still had the strength to scream. Then a face appeared above the pit's edge. A child. Human. Male, couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Bare feet caked in mud clothes that were more patches than original fabric, and a shock of dark hair that hung over eyes too large for his thin face. He stared down at her with an expression that cycled through surprise, fear, and something else Zareth couldn't quite identify. She waited for him to run. Every human child in 5 villages knew to run from orcs. The treaty was barely a year old, and generations of war didn't evaporate because some politicians signed papers. Fear ran deeper than policy. But the boy didn't run. He stood there, gripping the edge of the pit, staring at her with those enormous eyes. Zareth could see him processing what he was seeing. Her green skin, her tusks, her size even broken and half buried. Everything that should have sent him fleeing in terror. Instead, he did something that made no sense at all. He disappeared for a moment, then returned with something in his hands. Before Zareth could understand what was happening, he tossed it down into the pit. A piece of bread wrapped in cloth. It landed near her outstretched hand. Zareth stared at it, then at the boy, then back at the bread. "Why?" she managed to whisper, though she knew he probably couldn't hear her. The boy didn't answer. He just looked at her for another long moment, his expression solemn and ancient in a way that children's faces shouldn't be, and then he turned and ran. Zareth listened to his footsteps fade into the forest. Then she reached for the bread with trembling fingers, unwrapped it, and took a bite. It was stale and hard, probably several days old, but it was food. Real food, the first she'd had since falling into this pit. She didn't let herself hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope was just another way to hurt. The boy had probably been scared, had thrown the bread as appeasement before running to tell adults about the monster in the pit. By nightfall, there would be men with torches and weapons, and her death would at least be quick. That's what Zareth told herself. That's what made sense. But the fifth day came, and with it, the boy returned. This time he brought fish, two of them small but freshly caught, still glistening, and a water skin which he lowered down on a rope before pulling it back up. Zareth drank desperately, water running down her chin and soaking into her already drenched clothing. She couldn't remember the last time anything had tasted so good. "Thank you." She called up, her voice stronger now. The boy didn't respond. He just watched her drink, then pulled up the water skin and disappeared again. On the sixth day, he brought bread again, this time with wild berries wrapped in a leaf. He also brought a blanket, which he tried to lower down but couldn't manage. It was too bulky, kept getting caught on the broken timbers. Eventually, he gave up and just dropped it, and Zareth managed to pull it over herself with her one good arm. She should have been suspicious, should have questioned why this human child was helping her instead of running or reporting her presence. But the fever made thinking difficult, and honestly, she was too grateful to care about the why. He was keeping her alive day by day, and that was enough. On the seventh day, he brought someone else. Zareth heard two sets of footsteps this time. The boy's quick, light steps and something heavier. An adult. Her body tensed despite the pain. This was it then. The boy had finally told someone, and now the humans would come to finish what the pit had started. She tried to reach for her knife, the one still sheathed at her belt, but her arm wouldn't cooperate. Too weak. Too broken. A face appeared at the edge of the pit. Human male, young, mid-20s maybe. Dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw shadowed with several days' worth of stubble. His clothes were worn but clean, and he carried a pack over one shoulder. But what struck Zareth most were his eyes, brown, deep-set, and carrying the kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see fear there, carefully controlled but present. His hands trembled slightly where they gripped the edge of the pit, but he didn't leave. He didn't call for help or reach for a weapon. Instead, he said in accented but understandable Orcish, "My name is Callum Reed. I'm a healer. The boy says you've been down there for days. May I help you?" Zareth stared at him. Her fever-fogged mind struggled to process this. A human, offering help, speaking her language however poorly. It made no sense. It had to be a trick, or a hallucination, or both. "You should run," she managed to say. Her voice came out rough, aggressive, despite her intention. "I could kill you." It was true, or it had been true before the pit. Even injured, even dying, an orc was dangerous. He should be terrified. Callum Reed looked at her thoughtfully, like he was considering her words with academic interest rather than fear. "You could," he agreed quietly, "but you won't. You need help, and I'm here to give it if you'll let me." Huitai, the question came out sharper than she intended, but she needed to know, needed to understand why a human would risk himself for an orc. The war had only been over for a year. The bodies were barely cold. Trust wasn't something that grew overnight. Callum was quiet for a moment, and Zareth saw something flicker across his face. Pain, old and deep, the kind that burrowed into your bones and made a home there. "My father died in a logging accident when I was 10, he said finally. "I was there, supposed to be learning the trade. Watched a tree fall, wrong, watched it crush him before I could shout a warning. My mother worked herself to exhaustion, trying to keep us fed after that. She died of fever 3 years later, and I couldn't save her either. Didn't know enough about healing, didn't know enough about anything." He paused, and Zareth saw his hands tighten on the edge of the pit. "I've spent 13 years feeling useless. Weak, unable to save anyone who mattered. So when this boy Pip came to me this morning and said, there was someone dying in the old Carver pit, someone who needed help, I couldn't say no. I couldn't just walk away and let someone else die when maybe I could actually do something this time." The silence that followed was heavy with shared grief. Zareth understood loss. She'd lost her mother to fever too, though in a different way. And she'd lost Malthor, lost her place in the clans, lost everything that had defined her for years. This human, this Callum Reed, was offering her a chance. Not because he owed her anything, not because of politics or duty or expectation, just because he'd known loss and couldn't bear to witness more. "My leg is broken," Zareth said, surprising herself with the admission. "Trapped under that beam. Ribs are bad too, infection starting. I've been here 4 days." Callum nodded slowly. Then before Zareth could stop him or warn him or do anything at all, he began climbing down into the pit. It was reckless and stupid and brave in a way that made Zareth's chest tighten. He used the broken timbers as handholds, moved carefully, but with purpose, and within a minute, he was standing beside her in the mud and rainwater at the bottom of the pit. Up close, she could see he was thinner than she'd first thought. His clothes hung loose on a frame that looked like it rarely saw full meals. His hands were calloused from labor, but gentle as they began examining her injuries. He didn't flinch when he touched her green skin, didn't recoil from her tusks or her size or anything about her that should have marked her as other, as enemy, as monster. He just worked with quiet efficiency, pulling supplies from his pack. Clean cloth for bandages, a water skin, dried herbs that he crushed between his fingers and mixed with water to make a paste. A knife well-maintained that he heated over a small flame before using to cut away the fabric around her wounds. "This is going to hurt," he warned before touching the paste to her ribs. He wasn't wrong. The pain was sharp and immediate, and Zareth bit down hard to keep from crying out. But Callum's hands never wavered, never hesitated. He worked with the practiced calm of someone who'd done this before many times, and slowly the burning subsided into a more manageable ache. "The leg is the real problem," he said after wrapping her ribs. "The beam has to come off, but I can't do it alone. Too heavy. I'll need help and equipment." "Leave me," Zareth said. She meant it. This human had already risked more than she deserved. "You've done enough." Callum looked at her with those exhausted eyes, and something like amusement flickered there. "I've barely done anything, and I'm not leaving you to die in a hole. I couldn't save my parents, but I can save you." He said it with such quiet certainty that Zareth couldn't find words to argue. "I'll be back," Callum continued, already moving toward the pit's edge. "Few hours at most. I need to get rope pulleys, maybe another set of hands. Don't die while I'm gone." "I'll try," Zareth found herself saying, and it might have been the fever, but she thought she saw him almost smile. He climbed out of the pit with the same careful efficiency he'd used coming down. At the top, he paused and looked back at her. "What's your name?" he asked. Zareth hesitated. Her full name carried weight, power, obligation. But lying seemed wrong somehow. This human had climbed into a death trap to help her. He deserved truth. "Zareth. Zareth," he repeated, testing the syllables. "I'll be back soon, Zareth, I promise." Then he was gone, and Zareth was alone again, with her pain and her confusion and the strange, unfamiliar feeling of hope trying to take root in the hollow places of her chest. True to his word, Callum returned 3 hours later with Pip and an array of equipment that looked salvaged from various sources. Rope in different thicknesses, wooden beams for leverage, a complicated pulley system that Zareth didn't fully understand. And food, real food, bread, dried meat, even an apple that Pip must have stolen from somewhere. They worked through the afternoon and into evening. Callum directed operations from the pit, while Pip ran errands above, following instructions with serious dedication. The system they rigged was improvised, but functional, a testament to Callum's understanding of basic physics and Pip's willingness to follow complicated directions. Getting the beam off Zareth's leg took 2 hours and left her screaming into a piece of leather Callum had given her to bite down on. But when it was finally free and Callum had set the bone as best he could and splinted it with wood and cloth, the relief was almost as intense as the pain had been. Hauling Zareth out of the pit took another 4 hours. The pulleys helped, but she was dead weight and massive even by Orc standards. They had to stop frequently to adjust rope to give Pip's small muscles a rest to let Callum catch his breath. By the time they finally got her to the surface, all three of them were shaking with exhaustion. The sun was setting, painting the overgrown farmstead in shades of amber and shadow. Zareth lay on solid ground for the first time in days, rain-soaked grass beneath her open sky above her, and felt something dangerously close to gratitude. "Can you move her to the farmhouse?" Pip asked Callum, his voice small and worried. Callum looked at Zareth, then at the collapsed buildings of the Carver property, then back at Zareth. We'd have to carry her. She's got to weigh, what, 300 pounds? 320, Zareth corrected automatically, then almost laughed at the absurdity of the conversation. Right, 320. So no, I can't carry her. But we can make the farmhouse habitable. Clear out one room, get it dry, make it warm. It's not far. Better than leaving her outside. They worked into the night. Callum and Pip cleared the least damaged room in what had once been the main house, sweeping out years of debris and rot. They built up the fireplace with stones from the collapsed barn, stuffed gaps in the walls with cloth and moss, laid out every blanket they could find. It wasn't comfortable, but it was shelter. Moving Zareth the 50 feet from the pit to the farmhouse required the pulley system again and took another hour. By the time they finally got her settled on a pile of blankets by the fire, everyone was beyond exhausted. Pip fell asleep, almost immediately curled up in a corner like a cat. Callum sat in a chair that creaked ominously under his weight, his head tilted back, eyes closed. Zareth watched the firelight play across his features and tried to understand what had just happened. A human had saved her life. A human child had fed her for days without telling anyone, without asking for anything in return. They'd spent hours pulling her from certain death, asking nothing but that she stay alive. It made no sense. Humans and orcs didn't do this for each other. They fought, they killed, they maintained careful political distances even in peacetime. They didn't climb into pits or share food or work themselves to exhaustion for strangers. Why? Zareth asked the quiet room. Callum opened one eye. Why what? Why help me? You said about your parents, but that explains a compassion, not this. You risked your life climbing into that pit. You've spent an entire day saving someone who could kill you without thinking. Why? Callum was quiet for so long, Zareth thought he might have fallen asleep. But then he spoke, his voice soft in the firelit room. Everyone deserves basic dignity, even when the world says otherwise, especially then. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. He opened both eyes, now looking at her directly. I've spent 13 years living small, making myself smaller, wanting less, hoping for less, being less. Because everything I cared about got taken away. My father, my mother, my place in the village, all of it. Gone. And I thought if I just stopped caring, stopped wanting, it couldn't hurt anymore. He paused, and Zareth saw his hands grip the arms of the chair. But you don't stop caring, you just stop living. And when Pip came to me this morning, terrified and desperate, and insisting there was someone dying who needed help, I had a choice. I could stay small, stay safe, stay alone, or I could do something that mattered. Save someone. Make a difference. I'm an orc. I know. We killed humans, probably people you knew. I know that too. And you still helped. Yes. Zareth shook her head, immediately regretted it as the room spun. You're either very brave or very stupid. Callum smiled, a small, tired thing that transformed his exhausted face into something almost peaceful. Probably both. But you're alive, and that's worth being stupid for. He stood up, checking the fire one last time. I'm going to sleep now. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. Food, water, better bandages. Medicine if I can trade for it. One day at a time. Callum. He paused at the doorway. Thank you. The words felt foreign in her mouth. Zareth var Malthor, warrior and widow and leader, didn't thank people often. Gratitude implied debt, and debt implied weakness. But she owed this human more than she could ever repay, and pretending otherwise felt wrong. Callum nodded once, then disappeared into the next room. Zareth heard him settling down, heard Pip mumble something in his sleep, heard the rain start again on the damaged roof. She was alive. Against all odds, despite all logic, she was alive. And for the first time in 6 months since Malthor's death and the proposals and the flight south, Zareth felt something other than exhausted resignation. She felt curious about tomorrow. The second week began with smoke and cursing. Zareth woke to the acrid smell of something burning, and Callum's voice from the other room, a string of inventive profanity that would have impressed even the saltiest orc sailor. She pushed herself up on her elbows, careful not to jar her splinted leg, and called out, "What's burning?" "Nothing anymore." Callum appeared in the doorway holding what might have once been a rabbit. Now it looked like a piece of charcoal, vaguely shaped like meat. "I was trying to cook breakfast. It didn't cooperate." Pip peered around Callum's legs, took one look at the carbonized rabbit, and made a sound of pure despair. That was our only food, the boy said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine tragedy. Zareth stared at the blackened thing in Callum's hands, then at Callum's sheepish expression, then back at the rabbit. Something bubbled up in her chest, unfamiliar and strange, and before she could stop it, she was laughing. Real laughter, deep and genuine, the kind she hadn't felt in months. It hurt her ribs and made her head spin, but she couldn't stop. The absurdity of it all. A human who could set bones and rig pulleys and save lives, completely defeated by basic cooking. An orc warrior widow, helpless and healing, laughing at burned meat like it was the funniest thing in the world. Callum watched her with an expression caught between embarrassment and something softer. "I'm glad my failure amuses you," he said, but there was no real heat in it. How Zareth managed between gasps of laughter. "How did you burn it that badly?" "I put it too close to the fire." "For how long?" "I don't know. I was changing your bandages in here, and when I went back, it was like this." Zareth shook her head, wincing, as the movement pulled at healing wounds. "Is this how humans always prepare food, or are you just particularly bad at it?" Pip's giggle was like a bell in the dim room. Callum's mouth twitched, fighting a smile. "Probably the second one," he admitted. "Even orc children can roast meat without reducing it to ash." Zareth said, settling back against the makeshift pillow Callum had constructed from spare cloth. "Perhaps I should teach you before you accidentally poison us all. You can barely sit up. I can sit, and I can instruct. Tomorrow bring me something that hasn't already been murdered twice, and I'll show you how it's done." Callum nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. Relief, maybe? Or gratitude that she was engaging planning for tomorrow, acting like someone who intended to survive. "Tomorrow, then," he agreed. "But today, we eat whatever I can scavenge that doesn't require cooking." He disappeared again, and Zareth listened to him and Pip discussing options in the other room. Their voices had grown comfortable together over the past week, Pip's high and quick, Callum's low and patient. They'd established rhythms, routines. Pip foraged and fished and stole when necessary. Callum tended Zareth's wounds with careful precision, changed her bandages, twice daily, made her drink willow bark tea that tasted like punishment, but kept the fever at bay. And Zareth watched them both, learning. She learned that Callum flinched when anyone moved too quickly near him, like he expected violence from the world. She learned that Pip never ate until everyone else had taken their share, a habit born from scarcity and hard lessons. She learned that Callum talked to himself when he thought no one was listening, working through problems out loud, in a voice so quiet it was almost prayer. She learned that both of them were broken in ways that matched her own brokenness, and somehow that made the farmhouse feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. The cooking lesson happened 2 days later when Callum returned with a rabbit that was still alive and very indignant about its capture. Zareth, propped up in her chair with her leg elevated on a stool Callum had constructed, directed operations like a general commanding troops. "First, you prepare the fire. Not too large, not too small. You want coals, not flames. Flames char the outside and leave the inside raw." Callum built the fire according to her specifications, adjusting when she critiqued his coal arrangement. "Now the meat. Clean it properly. I don't care if you're squeamish. It needs to be done right." She watched as he worked, occasionally offering corrections. His hands were careful, methodical. He approached the task the same way he approached her medical care, with focused attention to detail. "The spit needs to be far enough from the heat that your hand can hover near it for a slow count of 5. Try." Callum held his hand near the prepared spit, counted, pulled back. 3 seconds before it's too hot. Then move it higher. They went through the process step by step. Zareth found herself enjoying it more than she'd expected. There was something meditative about teaching, about passing on knowledge. It reminded her of training sessions in the Northern Keep when she'd worked with younger warriors and watched them transform from clumsy recruits into competent fighters. "You turn it regularly," she instructed. "Every few minutes. Patience is the key. Most people want to rush it, but rushing ruins everything." "Story of my life," Callum muttered, then seemed to realize he'd said it out loud. Zareth studied him as he rotated the spit. There was a story there in the way he held himself, in the careful distance he maintained from everyone except Pip. A story about loss and isolation and choosing to live small because hoping for anything larger hurt too much. She understood that. She'd been living her own version of it for 6 months. I had to learn this skill young, she said quietly. My mother died when I was 13. Fever. My father remarried quickly, and his new wife made it clear I wasn't welcome at her hearth, so I learned to cook for myself, to care for myself. Independence born of necessity. Callum glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face. She'd been careful not to talk about her past, to reveal anything that might expose who and what she really was. But sitting in this farmhouse, watching a human carefully tend meat over a fire while a child played with stick figures in the corner, the secret felt less important than the moment. That must have been hard, Callum said carefully, losing your mother and your home at once. It taught me strength, taught me not to rely on anyone else for survival. Zareth adjusted her position, grimacing as the movement pulled at healing ribs. Though I'm discovering that lesson may have been too well learned. Sometimes accepting help isn't weakness. Sometimes it's wisdom. The rabbit finished cooking an hour later, and it was perfect. Golden skin, tender meat, the smell making Zareth's mouth water, despite her lingering weakness. They ate together, the three of them, siding in a rough circle with the fire at the center. Pip made happy sounds with every bite. Callum looked absurdly proud of his accomplishment, and Zareth felt something settle in her chest, something warm and solid and dangerously close to contentment. Acceptable, she pronounced, and smiled when Callum grinned. The days developed their own rhythm after that. Mornings, Callum changed Zareth's bandages and forced medicine down her throat with apologetic determination. Midday, Pip had his lessons. The boy couldn't read a fact that appalled Zareth and ignited something fierce and protective in her chest. She'd been taught young part of her training as Malthor's wife, expected to read treaties and correspondence. She couldn't stand the thought of this clever child going through life unable to access knowledge. So she taught him letters, scratching them in the dirt with a stick, when her strength allowed, making him practice until he could recognize each one on sight. She taught him the way she'd been taught to train warriors, with patience and high expectations, treating him like a young recruit rather than a helpless child. Pip responded to it like flowers to sunlight. He was hungry for learning, for attention, for someone to believe he was capable of more than survival. Within days, he could write his own name, and the pride on his face when he showed Callum made Zareth's throat tight. Afternoons, Callum fished or foraged, while Zareth rested and Pip practiced his letters. Evenings, they ate together and talked, carefully skirting around the big questions, focusing instead on small things. The weather, the state of the roof, whether the apples in the abandoned orchard were safe to eat. But underneath the mundane conversations, Zareth felt awareness growing. The way Callum's hands lingered just slightly when he checked her bandages. The way his eyes found hers across the room and held for heartbeats longer than necessary. The way her pulse jumped when he smiled, rare and genuine and transforming. She told herself it was gratitude. He'd saved her life. Natural to feel connection to someone who'd pulled you from death. Nothing more complicated than that. She told herself this even as she found excuses to keep him close, even as she learned the cadence of his breathing while he slept, even as she started to catalog small details, the scar on his left hand, the way he rubbed his neck when he was thinking, the sound of his rare laughter. 3 weeks after her rescue, Zareth's leg had healed enough to bear weight with the help of a crutch, Callum fashioned from a sturdy branch. She insisted on going outside just to the edge of the clearing, just to feel sun on her face after so long in the dim farmhouse. Callum stayed close, worried she'd push too hard, ready to catch her if she fell. They made it to a fallen log at the clearing's edge and sat together, watching Pip practice skipping stones on the small pond that had formed from weeks of rain. The silence between them was comfortable now, easy in a way Zareth hadn't experienced with anyone except Malthor. But this was different. With Malthor, silence had been about understanding and shared purpose. With Callum, it was about something she couldn't quite name, something that made her hyper-aware of how close he sat, how his shoulder almost touched hers. "Can I ask you something?" Callum said finally. "Yes." "Who are you really?" Zareth's chest tightened. She'd known this question was coming, had seen it building behind his eyes for days. He wasn't stupid. He'd noticed the expensive knife at her belt, the silver torque she'd never taken off despite the discomfort. He'd seen how she carried herself, how she commanded rather than requested, how Pip jumped to obey her instructions with the automatic response of someone used to hierarchies. She could lie, should lie. But sitting in the sunlight with this man who'd asked nothing of her except that she stay alive lying felt like a betrayal worse than any truth. My full name is Zareth Var Malthor, she said quietly. Malthor was war chief of the United Northern Clans. When he died, I inherited his seat on the council, his lands, his wealth, and the attention of every ambitious male who thought marrying me was the fastest path to power. Callum absorbed this without visible reaction, which was either very good or very bad. You're royalty? Not exactly. We don't have kings and queens. But yes, functionally, I'm one of the most politically powerful orcs in the Northern Territories. And you're here because I refuse to be property. 4 males proposed marriage in the months after Malthor died. Each one saw me as a prize to claim a stepping stone to the power they wanted. The 4th proposal came from Malthor's cousin Drekthar. He made it clear he considered me something he was entitled to. So I ran. She turned to look at Callum, needing to see his face. I came south to disappear, to be no one. Just another traveler in human lands where orc politics meant nothing. I had money skills, weapons. I didn't need a clan that saw me as a game piece instead of a person. Then the storm hit. And I fell into that pit thinking it was over, thinking I'd die free, at least even if I died alone. Callum was quiet for a long time, his eyes on Pip, throwing stones with fierce concentration. Thank you for telling me, he said finally. That's it. No questions about why I didn't say something sooner. No anger about the deception. You don't owe me your story. You never did. He shifted on the log, turning to face her more fully. I helped you because you needed help. Because Pip asked me to. Because I couldn't walk away from someone dying. Your title, your politics, your past, none of that matters. What matters is you're healing, you're safe, and you trusted me enough to tell me the truth. Something cracked open in Zarathal's chest, some carefully maintained wall she'd built around herself. I've never met anyone like you, she said, and her voice came out rougher than intended. Probably a good thing. If everyone was like me, nothing would ever get done. We'd all just hide in the woods and avoid responsibility. You're not hiding, you're surviving. There's a difference. Is there? Zareth thought about her flight from the Northern Keep, about 3 weeks of running from duty and obligation and expectation. I don't know anymore. Maybe we're both just trying to figure out how to live in a world that demands more than we want to give. Callum's hand moved, not quite touching hers, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin. Maybe, he said softly, or maybe we're learning that surviving and living aren't the same thing. Before Zareth could respond, Pip called out, excited about a fish he'd spotted near the pond's edge. They both turned to watch him, the moment breaking, but not disappearing, just transforming into something else. Something patient. That night, lying on her pile of blankets with Pip snoring softly in the corner and Callum's breathing steady from the next room, Zareth admitted something to herself that she'd been avoiding for days. She was falling for him. For this quiet, broken human who'd climbed into a pit to save her. Who taught a child to fish and burned rabbits and changed her bandages with gentle hands. Who saw her exhaustion and doubt and fear and never once asked her to be stronger than she was. It was impossible. Politically catastrophic, socially unacceptable in both their worlds, and absolutely terrifyingly real. The 4th week arrived with the sound of hoofbeats. Zareth heard them first, her warrior instincts still sharp despite weeks of recovery. Heavy horses, multiple riders moving through the forest with the confidence of people who expected obstacles to move aside. Her whole body went rigid. Callum, she called, her voice sharp with command. He appeared, immediately responding to her tone with automatic urgency. What's wrong? Riders, orc riders, coming here. She watched his face go pale, watched him move to the window and peer out carefully. Pip, sensing danger with a child's instinct, went very quiet and still in his corner. 3 of them, Callum reported. Big horses, armor. They look official. Zareth's mind raced. How had they found her? She'd been careful, covered her tracks. Unless someone in the villages she'd passed through had reported an orc traveling alone. Unless Drekthar had sent scouts south to search. Unless. She pushed herself up, reaching for the crutch, trying to transform from injured refugee to the woman who'd commanded respect in council halls. Her body protested, still too weak for the role she needed to play, but she forced it anyway. straightened her spine, lifted her chin, became Zareth Var Malthor, widow of the war chief leader and warrior. Stay inside, she told Callum. Absolutely not. These are my people, my politics. You don't need to be involved. Too late for that. He moved to stand beside her, and Zareth felt a rush of emotions she couldn't name. Fear for him, gratitude, frustration, affection, all tangled together. The riders entered the clearing and Zareth's breath caught. She recognized the lead warrior immediately. Commander Vex, captain of the Widow Guard, the elite unit assigned to protect the families of fallen chieftains. Vex dismounted with practiced efficiency, her ceremonial armor gleaming despite the journey. She took in the farmhouse, Callum standing in the doorway, and then her eyes found Zareth. Vex dropped to one knee so fast it looked painful. Your Majesty. The title hung in the air like smoke. Zareth saw Callum's expression shift from confusion to understanding to something more complicated. The other two warriors knelt as well, their heads bowed in formal respect. Rise, Zareth commanded, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned from Malthor. Vex stood, and Zareth could see the relief on her face warring with professional composure. We've been searching for 3 weeks. When you vanished from the keep without word, without guards, the council fell into chaos. Some feared assassination. Others claimed you'd abandoned your responsibilities. Drekthar has been spreading rumors calling your fitness to lead into question. Drekthar can drown in his own ambition, Zareth said coldly. I left because I refused to be auctioned off like livestock. I know, Majesty. We all know. But your absence has created a vacuum, and dangerous people are filling it. Zareth felt the weight of it settling back on her shoulders. Duty, responsibility. The clan politics she'd fled, all of it waiting patient and inevitable. Who is this human? Vex asked, her tone careful, but with an edge that suggested she was 3 seconds from deciding Callum had kidnapped her charge. His name is Callum Reed, Zareth said, making sure her voice carried absolute authority. He saved my life, tended my injuries, asked nothing in return. He is under my protection, and you will treat him with respect. Am I clear, Commander? Vex's eyebrows rose fractionally, but she nodded. Crystal clear, Majesty. Zareth turned to Callum, needing to see his face, needing to know what he was thinking. But he just looked at her with those deep, exhausted eyes and waited. We need to talk, she said quietly. Alone. Inside the farmhouse with Vex and her warriors waiting outside and Pip hiding in the back room, Zareth told Callum everything. The full truth. Malthor's death and the proposals and Drekthar's ambitions. The flight south and the weeks of freedom and the grain pit that nearly became her tomb. I hid who I was because I was tired of being a title instead of a person, she said, pacing despite the pain in her leg. Tired of every interaction being about what people wanted from me. You didn't know who I was, and you helped me anyway. You saw me. Just me. When was the last time anyone did that? Callum listened without interrupting, his expression carefully neutral. I never meant to deceive you, Zareth continued, but I also never meant to stay this long, to care this much about what you think, about what happens next. What does happen next? Callum asked quietly. I have to go back. Drekthar is making moves. If I don't return and face him, he'll undo everything Malthor worked for. He'll drag the clans backward into old hatreds and old wars. People will die. My people. I understand. Did he? Zareth searched his face, looking for anger or betrayal or hurt. But all she saw was acceptance tinged with resignation, and somehow that was worse. Do you? She demanded. Because I watched your face out there when Vex knelt. I saw you realize who I really am, what I am, and I know what you're thinking, that you saved some orc royalty who's going to ride off into her political drama and leave you here like none of this mattered. Is that what you're going to do? The question was soft, but it cut like her sharpest blade. I don't want to, Zareth said, and heard her voice crack. For 4 weeks, this farmhouse has been the freest I've felt in years. No expectations, no politics, just you and Pip and learning to cook rabbit properly. Just being seen for who I am instead of what I represent. I don't want to lose that. But you have to go. Yes. They stood in the dim room, the space between them feeling like miles. Then go, Callum said finally. Do what you need to do. Face your enemies. Protect your people. That's who you are. A leader. A protector. I see that now. That's not all I am. I know. Before Zareth could respond, before she could find words for the tangle of emotions in her chest, the farmhouse door slammed open. One of Vex's warriors stumbled in blood on his armor, eyes wide. "Assassins!" he shouted. Then the world exploded into violence. Two orc males in dark clothing burst through the windows, glass shattering, moving with lethal precision. Zareth recognized the style immediately. Drekthar's personal guard. He'd sent killers. One of them spotted Callum and grinned, saying something in rapid Orcish that made Zareth's blood freeze. The human pet. Kill him first. Send a message. The assassin moved toward Callum with a blade designed for gutting. Callum grabbed a chair, threw it, bought himself seconds. Not enough. The assassin was trained fast, stronger. This was going to end badly. Zareth didn't think. Her leg barely supported her weight. Her ribs screamed protest, but she threw herself between Callum and the blade anyway. Caught the assassin's wrist with one hand, felt the bone crunch under her grip. Used his momentum against him, twisted, heard something vital snap. The assassin howled, and Vex was there, finishing what Zareth started with brutal efficiency. The second assassin was already dead, Vex's other warrior, standing over the body, breathing hard. Silence fell, broken only by harsh breathing and Pip's muffled crying from the back room. Zareth turned to Callum, blood on her hands, fury in her eyes. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, too shocked to speak. Vex examined the bodies, her expression grim. "Drekthar's men. This is an act of war. He's violated sacred law by sending assassins after you. The prohibition against harming widows is absolute." Zareth barely heard her. She was focused on Callum, on the way his hands trembled, on how close she'd come to watching him die. "Why did he target Callum first?" she demanded. Vex's expression was carefully neutral. "Killing you is complicated. Sacred law's political fallout. But killing a human you've been living with that humiliates you, weakens your position, makes you look compromised, soft, influenced by human sentiment. It's a tactical move designed to destroy your credibility before moving against you directly." Something cold settled in Zareth's chest. "He's trying to turn my time here into a scandal." Yes. Zareth looked at Callum, really looked at him. This man who'd saved her life, who'd taught a child to read, who'd given her 4 weeks of freedom and seen her as just Zareth. Drekthar wanted to make him a weapon against her, wanted to use their connection to paint her as weak, as unfit to lead. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Callum found his voice finally. "For what?" "For putting you in danger, for making you a target, for dragging you into politics you never asked for." He stepped closer, and Zareth saw something fierce in his expression. "I climbed into that pit knowing what you were. Maybe not your title, but I knew you were Orc, knew there could be consequences. I chose to help anyway. This isn't your fault. Drekthar will use you against me. Then we don't give him the chance." Zareth wanted to believe it could be that simple, but she knew politics, knew how perception shaped reality in clan councils. Just surviving this assassination attempt wouldn't be enough. She needed to act decisively, needed to return and face Drekthar before he could spin this into something that destroyed them both. "I have to leave," she said. "Tonight. Now, before more assassins come." "I know." The words hung between them, heavy with everything unsaid. "Callum," Zareth started, then stopped. "How did you tell someone they'd changed everything, that 4 weeks in a half-ruined farmhouse had shown you what freedom felt like? That leaving felt like tearing out a part of yourself you'd just discovered existed?" She settled for truth, blunt and simple. "I love you." His eyes widened. Whatever he'd expected her to say, it wasn't that. "I know it's impossible. I know it's politically catastrophic and socially unacceptable and absolutely terrifying, but it's true. You're the first person in years who's seen me. Just me. Not my title or my potential or what I could give them, just Zareth. And I've fallen in love with you somewhere between the burned rabbit and teaching Pip his letters." Callum's expression did something complicated. "I love you too," he said, rough and honest. "I've been trying not to, telling myself it's gratitude or proximity or anything else. But I wake up thinking about you. I watch you teach Pip and feel my chest get tight. I know every expression on your face, every shift in your voice. And the thought of you leaving makes me want to tear this whole farmhouse down." "Then come with me." The words escaped before Zareth could stop them, reckless and desperate and entirely sincere. What? Come with me, back to the northern keep. Face this together. I'm human. Your people will never accept that. I don't care. I've spent 6 months doing what others expect. What if I chose something for myself instead? What if I fought for this for us? Callum stared at her, hope and fear warring in his expression. Your world will destroy us. Maybe, or maybe we're strong enough to survive it. Before he could answer, Vex cleared her throat from the doorway. Majesty, we need to leave. More assassins will come. Drekthar knows where you are now. Zareth nodded without taking her eyes off Callum. Will you wait for me? She asked. While I deal with Drekthar, stabilize the clans, make this safe. Will you wait? And if I can find a way, if I can make this possible, will you say yes? Callum's hand found hers, calloused fingers threading through her larger ones. I'll wait, he promised. However long it takes, I'll be here. They kissed, then desperate and gentle, tasting like hope and heartbreak. Zareth tried to memorize everything. The way his lips felt against hers, the sound of his breathing, the strength in his hands as they cradled her face. When they finally broke apart, both were shaking. I'll come back, Zareth swore. I'll find a way, I promise. Then she was moving, gathering her few possessions, saying goodbye to Pip, who clung to her, and made her promise not to forget them. Mounting the horse, Vex provided, ignoring the screaming protest from her still healing body. At the edge of the clearing, Zareth turned back one last time. Callum stood in the farmhouse doorway, Pip beside him, both watching her leave. The rising sun painted them in shades of amber and shadow. Zareth raised her hand in farewell. Callum raised his in return. Then she turned her horse north toward duty and politics and the battle that waited. But for the first time in 6 months, she wasn't running from something. She was fighting for something, for someone, for the impossible chance that love might be stronger than obligation and choice more powerful than duty. The forest swallowed her and the farmhouse disappeared behind the trees. But the memory of Callum's promise followed her all the way home. The journey north took 5 days of hard riding, pushing the horses to their limits. Zareth's body protested every mile, her injuries still too fresh for this kind of punishment, but she gritted her teeth and endured. Vex rode beside her, professional and watchful, while the other 2 warriors scouted ahead and behind, alert for more assassins. They talked little during the day, saving their breath for the ride. But at night, when they made camp in hidden clearings, Vex would sit beside Zareth and speak quietly about what awaited at the northern keep. Drekthar has been busy, Vex said on the 3rd night, firelight playing across her scarred features. He's claimed you abandoned your responsibilities, that you're unfit to hold Malthor's seat. He's been courting the council members, making promises, building alliances. 5 chieftains support him outright now. 3 more are wavering. And the others? Waiting to see what you do. If you come back strong, they'll support you. If you come back weak, they'll side with Drekthar to avoid being on the losing side. Zareth stared into the fire, thinking about Callum and Pip in the farmhouse, about the life she'd briefly tasted and was fighting to make permanent. I'm not weak, she said quietly. I'm angry, and anger can be very powerful when properly directed. Vex smiled, a rare expression that made her look almost gentle. That's what I was hoping you'd say. On the 5th day, they crested the final ridge, and the northern keep spread out below them. It was carved directly into the mountainside, a fortress of stone and iron that had stood for 300 years. Banners bearing 12 clan crests snapped in the wind. Smoke rose from forged chimneys. Warriors trained in the courtyard below their practice weapons, clacking in rhythms Zareth had grown up with. It should have felt like home. Instead, it felt like a cage she was willingly walking back into. But cages could be broken. Bars could be bent. And Zareth had learned in that grain pit that death was preferable to living without freedom. They entered the keep at sunset, and word of her return spread like wildfire. By the time Zareth dismounted in the main courtyard, a crowd had gathered. Warriors, servants, council members, all wanting to see the widow who'd vanished for a month and returned with blood on her armor and fire in her eyes. Drekthar was there too, standing on the council hall steps with his supporters arrayed behind him. He looked confident, comfortable, like a male who'd already won and was just waiting for official confirmation. His smile when he saw Zareth was sharp as broken glass. "The widow returns," he called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. How generous of you to grace us with your presence after abandoning your people for weeks. Tell us, cousin widow, where have you been? Zareth dismounted slowly, letting the crowd see her injuries. Her splinted leg, the fresh bandages visible beneath her armor. Let them see she'd been hurt, that her absence hadn't been vacation or cowardice. I was trapped in a collapsed grain pit in human territory. She said, her voice clear and strong, despite her exhaustion. Dying, until a human healer and a child saved my life, asking nothing in return. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. And 2 nights ago, Zareth continued, assassins wearing your house colors, Drekthar, attacked that same farmhouse. They tried to kill the humans who'd shown me more honor than you've shown in your entire political career. They violated sacred law by targeting a widow under protection. The murmurs grew louder. Several council members exchanged sharp looks. Drekthar's smile faltered for just a moment. Lies. You have no proof. Vex stepped forward, holding up the cloth pieces cut from the assassin's armor. House colors unmistakable, even at a distance. Commander Vex and 2 witnesses saw these males attack, Zareth said. They're dead now, but their presence, their colors, their violation of sacred law, all of it points to you. Circumstantial, Drekthar said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. Then let's make it simple, Zareth said. I invoke the ancient right. Trial by combat, single challenge for leadership. You claim I'm unfit to hold this seat. Prove it with a blow instead of with assassins and lies. The crowd went completely silent. Trial by combat was old law rarely invoked in modern times, but it was unbreakable law. If Zareth issued the challenge and Drekthar refused, he'd look weak before the entire council. If he accepted, one of them would die, and the matter would be settled permanently. Drekthar's eyes narrowed. She could see him calculating weighing options. He was larger, stronger, had more recent combat experience. She was barely healed from injuries, had spent weeks recovering rather than training. On paper, it should be an easy victory, but there was hesitation. Because losing would end everything, and winning might spark questions about why he'd been so eager to kill a widow he claimed to want to marry. You're injured, he said finally. Barely recovered. This would be murder, not combat. Concern for my welfare. How touching. I accept the risk. Do you accept the challenge? The entire keep waited. Warriors, council members, servants. All watching Drekthar, waiting to see if he'd prove himself a warrior or a coward. He smiled slowly. I accept. Tomorrow at dawn. Traditional rules. First blood yield or death. Let the clans see which of us is truly worthy to lead. Zareth inclined her head, keeping her expression neutral, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Tomorrow, then, may the strongest survive. She walked into the keep with her head high and her spine straight, Vex at her side. But once they reached her private quarters, the performance crumbled. Zareth's leg gave out and she collapsed into a chair, breathing hard. That was reckless majesty, Vex said quietly, checking Zareth's bandages. You're not at full strength. Drekthar is a seasoned warrior. This fight could kill you. I know. Then why? Zareth looked out the window at the mountains beyond, thinking about a farmhouse 400 miles south, about a human who had promised to wait. Because I'm tired of running, tired of letting fear make my decisions, tired of being someone else's prize or someone else's weapon. She turned to face Vex. I want to choose. For once in my life, I want to choose my own path. And that starts with ending Drekthar's ambitions permanently. And the human Callum Reed. Zareth felt something tight in her chest at his name. If I survive tomorrow, I'm going to ask him to come here, to stand beside me, not as a scandal or a weakness, but as my chosen partner. Vex's eyebrows rose. The council will never accept that. A human consort is unprecedented. It would cause political chaos. Good. This council needs chaos. Needs to be reminded that we're not the same clans that went to war with humanity, that we can be better, stronger, more than our old hatreds. Zareth smiled sharp and determined. Malthur taught me that change requires courage. Tomorrow I prove I have that courage, and then I'm going to change everything. Vex studied her for a long moment, then knelt. The Widow Guard stands with you, Majesty, whatever you choose, whoever you choose. Even if it's politically insane, especially then, you've never been conventional. Why start now? Dawn came cold and clear. The combat circle had been prepared in the keep's main courtyard, a ring of sand 40 feet across with the 12 clan banners planted around its perimeter. Every orc in the keep had gathered to watch hundreds of warriors and civilians alike, all wanting to witness history. Zareth entered the circle wearing minimal armor, leather and chain only leaving her arms free for mobility. She carried a single blade Malthor's sword, the one he'd given her when they married. It felt right somehow to carry his steel into this fight. Drekthar entered from the opposite side fully armored and carrying a massive war axe that had carved through dozens of enemies. He looked confident, relaxed, even like this was a formality rather than a real threat. The eldest chieftain Crow of the mountain clan stood at the circle's edge to officiate. Trial by combat, ancient law, first blood yield or death. No interference, no mercy. Begin when ready. Zareth and Drekthar circled each other, and the world narrowed to just them, just this moment. Last chance to yield, Drekthar said. Marry me and I'll let you live. You can even keep your human pet as a servant. I'm not unreasonable. I'd rather die. That can be arranged. He attacked with brutal efficiency, the axe sweeping in an arc designed to take her head off. Zareth ducked under it, felt the wind of its passing, used his momentum to create distance. Her ribs screamed protest at the movement, but she forced the pain down, locked it away. Drekthar was stronger, larger, had reach and weight advantages. But Zareth had spent weeks learning patience from Callum, had relearned that strength wasn't always about force. She let him attack again, dodged instead of blocking, made him work for every strike. His axe was powerful but heavy, and swinging it repeatedly would tire him faster than her lighter blade tired her. The fight developed a rhythm. Drekthar attacking Zareth, evading. The crowd murmured, uncertain. This wasn't the quick, brutal combat they'd expected. Stop running, Drekthar snarled. Fight like a warrior. I am fighting. You're just too slow to notice. His next strike came faster, fueled by anger. Zareth sidestepped, brought her blade across his forearm, not deep, just enough to draw blood and make on him drop the axe. First blood. Technically, she'd won, but Zareth didn't step back, didn't claim victory, because drawing first blood wasn't enough. She needed to end this completely, needed to remove Drekthar as a threat forever. Drekthar drew a knife, switching to close combat. He was faster with the smaller weapon, more dangerous. They traded strikes, blade meeting blade, and Zareth felt her injuries protest with every movement. Her leg wasn't fully healed. Her ribs ached, but she pushed through, focused on Callum's face in her memory, on Pip's laughter, on the promise she'd made. She would survive this. She would win, and she would choose her own future. The opening came when Drekthar overextended, putting too much weight behind a thrust meant to gut her. Zareth twisted aside, caught his wrist, used a joint lock Malthor had taught her years ago. Heard bone crack. Drekthar's knife fell to the sand. Zareth kicked it away, then put her blade to his throat. The crowd went silent. Drekthar stood frozen, breathing hard, eyes wide with the realization that he'd lost, that she'd beaten him, that his ambitions ended here. Yield, Zareth commanded. Never. Then die. She could do it. Press forward, open to his throat, end him permanently. Ancient law said she had that right. He'd sent assassins, violated sacred prohibitions, tried to take everything from her. But Callum's voice echoed in her memory, about choosing kindness when you could choose violence, about being better than the worst impulses that defined you. I could kill you, Zareth said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. Ancient law gives me that right. You sent assassins. You violated sacred trust. Your life is forfeit. She pressed the blade just hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. But I choose mercy. I choose to show that strength isn't just about who can kill most efficiently. It's about who can lead with wisdom. She stepped back, lowering her blade. You're exiled, Drekthar, stripped of rank, lands, and seat. You have until sunset to leave the northern territories. If you return, if you threaten me or mine again, mercy ends. Clear. Drekthar's face cycled through humiliation, rage, and finally defeated acceptance. He nodded once, sharp and bitter, then turned and limped from the circle. The crowd erupted, some cheering, some uncertain, all processing what they'd witnessed. Zareth stood in the center of the combat ring, bleeding and exhausted and victorious, and felt something settle in her chest. She'd won. Not just the fight, but her freedom, her right to choose. Now she just needed to figure out what to choose. The weeks that followed were a blur of politics and rebuilding. Zareth consolidated power, reaching out to allies, neutralizing Drekthar's remaining supporters. She made it clear she would rule alone, no forced marriages, no compromises on her autonomy. She implemented reforms Malthor had dreamed of. Open trade negotiations with human territories began the slow work of transforming the council from a war-focused hierarchy into something more diplomatic. And she thought about Callum constantly. 6 months passed, 6 months of ruling, of making changes, of slowly building a foundation stable enough to risk what she planned next. 6 months of lying awake at night, wondering if he was still waiting, if he'd moved on, if the promise they'd made meant anything after so much time apart. Finally, when her position was secure enough to risk it, Zareth wrote a letter. Her hands shook as she formed the words in common tongue, hoping her grammar was correct, hoping he could read her writing. Callum had defeated Drekthar, reclaimed my seat, stabilized the clans. I'm safe now, or as safe as anyone in politics can be. But it feels hollow without you. I've been thinking constantly about what I want versus what I'm supposed to want, about duty and desire, about the future I could have versus the future I'm expected to have. I'm tired of those things being different. I'm offering you a choice. 3 options. I need you to understand, I mean all of them completely. Option 1, come to me. Be my consort. Stand beside me as partner and advisor. It will be politically complicated. Many will oppose a human in that role. You'll face prejudice, danger, people who want to use you to hurt me. But you'll also have status protection, the voice in decisions that shape 2 species' futures. I can't promise it will be easy. I can only promise I want you here. Option 2, stay where you are. I'll grant you lands, wealth, protection extended over your territory. I'll visit when I can, though my duties won't allow it often. We can have stolen moments, secret happiness, whatever fragments are possible. It won't be a real life together, but it will be something. Option 3, choose neither. I'll respect your decision, never contact you again. Remember our time together as the one pure thing in my life. I'll ensure you're safe and provided for, but from a distance if that's what you want. I love you. That's perhaps the most foolish thing I've ever admitted in writing. But it's true. You saw me when I was just Zareth, not a title or a prize or a political piece. You gave me 4 weeks of freedom and I'll treasure forever. Think carefully. Send your answer with Commander Vex. Whatever you choose, I'll support it, even if it breaks my heart. Yours if you'll have me, Zareth. She sealed the letter with her personal crest, hands trembling, and gave it to Vex with instructions to ride south immediately. Then she waited. The waiting was agony. Zareth threw herself into work, into council meetings and trade negotiations and reform implementations, anything to keep her mind occupied. But every night she lay awake imagining Callum reading her letter, imagining his face as he decided her fate. 2 weeks passed. The round trip should take 2 weeks minimum, Vex had said, maybe 3 if weather slowed the horses. On the 15th day, Zareth was in the council chamber reviewing agricultural reports when the door opened and Commander Vex entered. And behind her, looking overwhelmed and determined in equal measure, was Callum Reed. Zareth stood so fast her chair toppled backward. For a moment she could only stare, convinced he was hallucination brought on by too much work and too little sleep. But no, he was real. Thinner than she remembered, wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, clearly exhausted from travel. But real solid here. You came, she whispered. You asked, he said simply. How could I not? The space between them disappeared. Zareth didn't remember moving, but suddenly she was holding him, breathing in his scent of pine and river water, feeling his arms wrap around her waist. He was so much smaller than her, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except that he was here. I wasn't sure you'd wait, Zareth said into his hair. 6 months is a long time. I thought maybe you'd moved on, found someone else, decided I wasn't worth the risk. I told you I'd wait. I don't break promises. He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. Also, Pip wouldn't let me. Kid's terrifying when he's determined. He said if I didn't go to you, he'd drag me here himself. Zareth laughed, the sound breaking through tension she'd carried for months. Where is Pip? Vex brought him too. Said she wasn't separating us again. He's being shown around by some very confused guards who aren't sure what to do with an 8-year-old human child who keeps asking questions about everything. I'll make him a ward of the court, ensure his education, give him opportunities he'd never have otherwise. He'd like that. Kid's brilliant when someone actually bothers to teach him. They stood there holding each other, and Zareth felt something she hadn't felt in months. Complete. Whole. Like pieces of herself she'd scattered across 400 miles had finally reassembled. The council is going to lose their minds, she said eventually. A human consort is unprecedented. Half of them will oppose it on principle. I know. Vex explained the political situation pretty thoroughly during the ride north. I'm prepared for hostility. Well, are you prepared for danger? For people who'll try to use you against me? For a life where you're constantly scrutinized and judged? Callum's expression turned serious. I'm prepared to be with you, however that looks, whatever it costs. You climbed out of that grain pit. I can climb into yours. Zareth kissed him, then deep and desperate and full of 6 months of longing. And when they finally broke apart, both breathless, she made a decision. Tomorrow I'm calling a council session. I'm going to announce my intention to take you as consort. And we're going to face whatever comes together. Together, Callum agreed. I like the sound of that. A week had passed since Zareth returned to the Northern Keep. 7 days of political maneuvering, of carefully worded conversations, of rebuilding alliances that had fractured during her absence. 7 days of pretending she was whole, when half her heart remained uncertain about the massive gamble she was about to take. The council chamber felt different this morning. Heavier. The 12 chieftains sat in their circle, each in their carved seat of power, each radiating varying degrees of curiosity about why Zareth had called this emergency session. They didn't know yet, didn't understand what she was about to propose. Zareth stood before them with Callum at her side. She dressed him in formal clothing that approximated Orc's ceremonial dress, made sure he looked dignified rather than diminished. But even dressed well, he was obviously human, obviously smaller, obviously everything that council would consider weakness. Chieftain Crow spoke first, his voice heavy with impatience. You've called us here at dawn, Majesty. I trust this is important. It is, Zareth said clearly. I'm announcing my intention to take a consort. Callum Reed of the Human Territories. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the chamber erupted. Unprecedented. A disgrace. Have you lost your mind? Zareth let them shout for a moment, then raised her hand for silence. Eventually, grudgingly, they quieted. This is unprecedented, she agreed, but so was Malthor uniting 5 clans. So was the peace treaty with humanity. Progress always looks unprecedented until it becomes normal. This isn't progress, Crow said. It's a disgrace to Malthor's memory, to everything he built. Malthor taught me that strength comes from adaptability, Zareth countered. From building bridges instead of burning them. Callum Reed saved my life when I was dying in human lands. He asked nothing in return. He showed more honor than many orcs I've met. Honor doesn't make him suitable, another chieftain interjected. He's weak, can't defend himself, makes you look compromised. He's here because I choose him, because I value intelligence and compassion over brute strength, because our people need to learn that power comes in many forms. The arguments went on for hours. Some chieftains claimed she was betraying her species. Others suggested she was still weak from injury, not thinking clearly. One particularly bold male suggested Callum had somehow ensorcelled her with human magic. Through it all, Callum stood silent beside her, enduring their scrutiny with quiet dignity that Zareth found devastating and admirable in equal measure. Finally, she'd had enough. Orc law allows widows autonomy over their own marriages. I don't need council approval. I'm not asking permission. I'm informing you of my decision out of courtesy. And if we refuse to accept it, Crow demanded, then you can try to remove me from power. Issue a challenge. Face me in combat like Drekthar did. See how that works out. Zareth let steel enter her voice. I've killed assassins and defeated ambitious males. I've reclaimed this seat and stabilized your clans. I've earned the right to choose my own partner. And I choose Callum Reed. The silence that followed was tense and uncomfortable. He'll need a formal position, Vex said from her spot at the chamber's edge. something that justifies his presence beyond just being your consort. Otherwise, the whispers will never stop. Zareth nodded slowly. Vex was right. Callum needed a role, a purpose that served the clans and demonstrated his value. I'm creating a new position, she announced. Human liaison, someone who understands both our people and theirs, who can advise on cultural differences, facilitate trade negotiations, represent human perspectives in our discussions. It was brilliant, even if Zareth thought so herself. The treaty with humanity was barely a year old. Both sides were still navigating how to coexist. Having someone who understood both cultures was genuinely useful, not just political theater. Several chieftains exchanged looks. Zareth could see them reassessing, realizing that opposing this meant admitting they didn't value human relations, which would undermine their own trade agreements and diplomatic efforts. The position requires someone who knows both worlds, Zareth continued, who's lived in both, who can speak both languages. Callum Reed is uniquely qualified. His appointment serves the clan's interests, not just my personal desires. The vote, when it finally came, was close. 7 chieftains in favor, 5 opposed. But it passed. Callum was officially recognized as human liaison and Zareth's chosen consort. It wasn't universal acceptance. It wasn't easy. But it was enough. The months that followed tested them both in ways Zareth hadn't fully anticipated. Callum struggled with Orc customs constantly. He spoke when he should have been silent, showed deference when Orcs valued directness, tried to soften his words when bluntness was expected. He made mistakes that would have been funny if they weren't so painful to watch. 2 months after his arrival, a young warrior named Craven issued a formal challenge. He claimed Callum was unworthy of Zareth and demanded trial by combat for her hand in marriage, citing obscure precedent that required the challenged party to either fight or concede the claim. Zareth tried to refuse on Callum's behalf, offered to choose a champion, but Craven had structured the challenge to prevent substitution. If Callum refused, he'd be admitting unworthiness and Zareth would lose credibility. If he fought, he'd likely die. I'll fight, Callum said quietly when she explained the situation. Absolutely not. I'd rather lose political standing than watch you dying in an arena. And I'd rather die trying than prove every orc who thinks I'm weak right. I'm tired of being underestimated, Zareth. Tired of being the joke. Let me do this. She wanted to refuse, wanted to protect him. But she also understood what he needed. The same thing she'd needed when facing Drekthar. The chance to prove himself on his own terms. The trial by combat drew an even larger crowd than her duel with Drekthar. Craven entered the circle in full armor, with a massive battle-axe confidence radiating from every movement. Callum entered with a borrowed sword he clearly barely knew how to hold, and desperation in his eyes that made Zareth's chest ache. The rules were simple: first blood yield or death. Craven charged immediately, planning to end this quickly. But Callum didn't try to block or parry. He dodged, using speed and smaller size to his advantage, making Craven work for every swing. The crowd murmured, confused. This wasn't combat, it was running. Then Callum saw his opening. Craven overextended on a particularly vicious swing, and Callum darted in, struck at the warrior's knee joint where armor didn't fully cover. It wasn't a killing blow, barely even a serious wound, but it drew blood. Immediately, Callum stepped back and yielded, declaring Craven the victor of first blood. The crowd went silent, confused. Craven looked furious, humiliated, in a way he hadn't anticipated. Zareth stood and addressed the assembly, her voice carrying across the courtyard. Callum Reed drew first blood, proving he's capable in combat. He then yielded to prevent unnecessary death, showing mercy and wisdom. The letter of the law has been satisfied. He neither refused the challenge nor was defeated. He simply chose not to escalate to lethality. It was a loophole and everyone knew it, but it was a legal loophole. And more importantly, it showed that Callum wasn't just Zareth's weakness. He was clever, brave, willing to face danger in his own way. Some of the council members actually smiled. Not acceptance exactly, but respect. It was a start. 6 more months passed. Months of Callum learning, adapting, proving himself in small ways that accumulated into grudging acceptance. His trade negotiations with southern human territories brought wealth to the clans. His insights into human thinking prevented several diplomatic incidents. His willingness to endure hostility without complaint slowly wore down even the most resistant chieftains. And Pip thrived. Zareth had made him a ward of the court, ensured he received the same education as young orc nobles. The boy devoured knowledge like a starving person devoured food, learning languages and history and diplomacy with fierce dedication. At 9 years old, he could read and write in both Common and Orcish, could discuss political theory with council members, could move between human and orc worlds with an ease that made him invaluable. Zareth watched him sometimes and thought about bridges, about how this child who'd brought her food when she was dying was becoming the first real bridge between their species. Not through conquest or treaty, but through simply existing as proof that both worlds could coexist in one person. A year after Callum's arrival on a cool autumn evening, Zareth found him in the palace gardens tending herbs he'd planted from seeds brought from the farmhouse. Pip was there too, now taller and leaner, reading from a thick book about interspecies trade agreements. The council gave full approval today, Zareth said, settling onto the bench beside Callum. Unanimous vote. Your trade agreement with the southern human territories was the deciding factor. Callum looked up, surprise and satisfaction mixing on his face. Unanimous. Even Crow voted yes, said you'd proven your value, that having you here makes us stronger, not weaker. Only took a year and nearly dying in combat. Patience, remember, you taught me that. They sat in comfortable silence, shoulders touching. Pip read quietly nearby, occasionally asking questions that showed he was processing complex ideas far beyond his years. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of amber and purple. I've been thinking, Zareth said, about the day we met, how I was dying in that pit, convinced my story ended there. How you climbed down to help me anyway. You've mentioned that a few times, because I still can't quite believe it happened. That you saw an orc, knew what I was, knew the danger, and helped anyway. Callum set down his gardening tools and turned to face her fully. I saw someone who needed help. The rest was just details. Those details matter in our worlds. Maybe, but they didn't matter to Pip when he brought you food every day. They didn't matter to me when I climbed into that pit. And they still don't matter now. He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. I love you, Zareth. Not the title, not the power, not what you represent. Just you. The woman who laughed at my burned rabbit, who taught Pip to read with warrior discipline, who chose to come back here and fight instead of staying hidden. That's who I love. Zareth felt her chest tighten with emotion. I love you too, for climbing into that pit when you should have run, for seeing me as Zareth instead of the Widow Queen, for being patient with me while I figured out that duty and desire don't have to be enemies. And, Callum prompted, because he knew her well enough to hear the unfinished thought. And for teaching me that impossible things are just difficult things that require courage. You're the bravest person I know, and I'm grateful every day that you chose to be here. Pip looked up from his book. Are you two going to kiss now, because I can leave if you want privacy? They both laughed, and Zareth ruffled Pip's hair with her free hand. Stay, your family. You get to witness all the embarrassing moments. Great, Pip said, but he was grinning. As the sun set over the northern keep, painting the gardens in shades of twilight, Zareth reflected on how far she'd come, from the grain pit to this moment, from drowning in obligation to choosing her own path, from believing she had to be either a widow or a leader to understanding she could be both and more. She'd found freedom not by running from duty, but by redefining what duty meant. Not by rejecting her role, but by claiming the right to fill that role on her own terms. Two worlds had collided in a grain pit, an orc widow and a human healer, a terrified child and impossible kindness. And from that collision, something new had emerged. Not quite orc, not quite human, but something better than either alone. A bridge, a possibility, a future where children like Pip didn't have to choose which half of themselves to hide. I am Zareth Varmalther, she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Widow, queen, warrior, teacher, partner, an architect of a future where my people and Callum's people build together instead of apart. She looked at Pip, absorbed in his book about trade agreements, already dreaming of the bridges he would build. He'll be the first, she continued, the first human educated in orc history and common tongue both, the first bridge between our worlds. But he won't be the last. Callum smiled, that rare, genuine expression that still made her heart skip. You're building something bigger than us. We're building it, Zareth corrected. All three of us. A world where children don't have to choose which half of themselves to hide. Where love doesn't have to be impossible. Where climbing into a pit to save a stranger isn't brave, it's just decent. She thought about her mother's final words, about the fire she'd carried all these years, about how Malthor had fanned that fire into something useful, something powerful, about how Callum had shown her that fire didn't always have to burn, sometimes it could warm. I kept my promise, she whispered, thinking of her mother. I didn't let them put out my fire. I just learned to control it better. The garden settled into peaceful quiet. Pip returned to his reading. Callum went back to his herbs. Zareth sat between them, feeling the weight of her titles and the lightness of her choices balanced perfectly. She'd climbed out of the pit. They'd all climbed out together, each pulling the others up in turn. And the view from here, the future spreading out before them, full of possibility and challenge and hope, was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined when she was dying alone in the dark. Two worlds, one love. And against all odds, it was enough, more than enough.